Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, when scientists and politicians go to war, the first casualty is truth.
The whole global warming theory may be nothing more than hot air.
The coverage of Copenhagen and the Climate Change Summit. Rupert Murdoch and the Saudi prince. News Corp ups its stake in the Middle East. The blogosphere, still the place to go for news from Iran. And out of Australia and across the world. A different kind of oil lobby. News stories don't get much more complex, more complicated than the issue of climate change. That made the coverage of the Climate Change Conference this past week highly problematic. If the more than 100 national leaders in Copenhagen cannot agree on how to deal with the issue, or even if the problem is man-made, how could they possibly agree on a solution? Especially when an email scandal that came to be known as Climategate emerged and threatened to debunk climate science and undermine the entire conference before it even began. The news media in Copenhagen were left to sift through the sound bites and separate scientific fact from ideological fiction. Our starting point this week is the planet Earth, the conference in Denmark, the emails from Britain, and the newspapers from around the world that came together on an issue that has politicians divided.
105 leaders descend on Denmark for the 12-day-long climate summit.
Why is this summit important? Well, it is a global story.
The world's biggest ever climate talks, which begin in Copenhagen.
You have 192 countries here. You have world leaders from more than 100 countries.
The biggest climate conference in history has opened in Copenhagen amid calls for action.
To agree a deal which will change the way the world tackles global warming.
The outcome of the summit in the Danish capital will shape international policy on global warming for decades to come.
It is that important, it is that significant. That's why the media is all over it.
5,000 members of the media, and they are just the ones on the inside. The conference organizers stopped handing out media passes 1 month before the summit started because they ran out of room. So, no shortage of journalists, but what about the quality of the journalism?
I think reporters should be doing two things. The first is they should be talking to legitimate climate scientists about this, not industry front groups. The second is, when you have these people who are making these outrageous claims...
We've got 250 years of coal supplies. We need to invest in clean coal technology and not take coal off the table.
Reporters have to start asking questions about their qualifications and their funding.
The biggest challenge when it comes to reporting on climate change is breaking down the science. These are pretty complicated ideas, but they have to be explained very simply to the people at home, and also sometimes to the journalists who are doing the reporting. When they talk about carbon trading, what exactly does that mean? When they talk about setting targets, you've got to explain how they come about that figure and what it means for the world as a whole.
I think the biggest challenge is keeping the message fresh, and particularly when we're talking about some very, very serious and catastrophic impacts. How do you avoid that always being a doom and gloom scenario?
Countries like Bangladesh are facing devastation from rising seas.
Reporters know the phenomenon of war fatigue, and there's a danger that we get climate fatigue if we only focus on the doom and gloom.
So when a fresh angle to the story surfaces, such as the recent Climategate mini-scandal, it triggers a flurry of contradictory news reports.
There's a new scandal that's burning up the net these days.
Hackers managed to steal an exchange of emails between one scientist and his colleagues. In those emails, he suggested perhaps that they should hide some of the results, which showed that climate change wasn't entirely the fault of man.
The whole global warming theory may be nothing more than hot air.
Climategate was one of those classic cases of a story which, on the face of it, at a quick skim, looked really smelly. But when you really sat down and looked at the language, it just didn't stack up.
Virtually every major scientific academy in the world has said that the climate is changing, humans have something to do with it, and the implications are very serious. These emails have not changed that. Yet, if you read the media coverage on this right now, you would think that there's some big doubt about whether or not climate change is actually happening. My view is that this is bad journalism.
These emails, if you read through them, they're pretty damaging.
There's also an interesting political angle to it. Who has hacked these emails? Why is that happening? What vested interests are behind trying to derail these talks? And why are some government delegations now cynically using this development in order to question the science when they themselves, don't forget, signed off on it.
Scientists have been pumping out hot air of their own.
While climate change skeptics insisted that Climategate debunked the science that says global warming is man-made, the skeptics themselves were having their theories debunked online by armies of bloggers writing or talking about the conference.
It's about our future.
I think blogging brings diversity and an alternative voice that is very much lacking at conferences such as this one. I think by the virtue of the fact that blogging is a one-person operation, I feel as if, particularly with issues so abstract and complex as climate change, where bloggers are able to relay the terms on a human level. And so something that may seem very distant and foreign when delivered through a blogger translates better onto the public.
One of the most ambitious media projects associated with the conference was undertaken by the left-leaning British newspaper, The Guardian, which managed to get papers from around the world to publish the same editorial on the same day, calling for action on climate change.
Our thinking was that climate change is such a huge issue. No individual newspaper could really make any impact on a moment of that size, on a meeting of that scale. But what would happen if a really sizable portion of the world's major newspapers got together and spoke with one voice? And we thought that really could be quite a significant thing if we pulled it off.
56 newspapers in 45 countries published the editorial, most on the front page. The Hindu from India, Novaya Gazeta from Russia, Hurriyet from Turkey, An Nahar in Lebanon, France's Libération, Canada's Toronto Star, and the Gulf News out of Dubai. Together, they all said social justice demands that the industrialized world digs deep into its pockets and pledges cash to help poorer countries adapt to climate change. It is in that spirit that 56 newspapers from around the world have united behind this editorial. If we, with such different national and political perspectives, can agree on what must be done, then surely our leaders can too. But conspicuous by their absence from the list of papers that published the editorial were the major American dailies, the Washington Post, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and Chicago Tribune.
It was certainly disappointing not to have even one of the frontline US papers. I had really constructive conversations with the Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, and all of them were very positive about the project. The issue with them was around the idea of adopting someone else's viewpoint as their own, and I think they very jealously guard the sort of independence of the editorials, but I am sad not to have them.
Sad, but probably not surprised. On the climate change issue, consensus exists within most of the scientific community on what causes it and what to do about it. However, the politicians and the media, they're a different story. Here's how our Global Village voices see the reporting of the climate change story.
The journalistic habit of balancing in the quest for objectivity, in other words, giving both points of view on a story equal airtime, while fine for politics, is unsuited to science reporting.
You have two separate paradigms at play. You have one outlet of the media which is trying to expose the fraudulent activities of the scientific community, but then you also have another fringe outlet which is trying to turn this story into a cybersecurity type issue, really drawing attention away from the true issue at hand.
The real issue here is how the media has failed in its duty to bring both sides of the issue to the public, and it's really taken sides on this issue and in order to focus on the public policy debate rather than on the underlying science.
We've now got more than 3,500 viewers following us on Facebook and Twitter. They check in with us to find out what stories we're working on in case they want to weigh in as one of our Global Village voices. You can do the same, or you can just get in touch with us via email. We're waiting to hear from you at listeningpost@aljazeera.net. Time now for Listening Post News Bites. The civil war in Sri Lanka is over. The threats to journalists are not. We've interviewed Frederica Jans on this broadcast before. She became the editor-in-chief of the Sunday Leader newspaper after Lasantha Wickrematunge was shot and killed earlier this year. Jans has told the media freedom group Reporters Without Borders that she has received a death threat. That threat, she says, came in a handwritten note similar to one that Wickrematunge got before he was murdered. And a handwriting expert has confirmed that the two notes came from the same source. In the last 11 cases of journalists being murdered in Sri Lanka, there hasn't been a single conviction. That bombing in Somalia on December 3rd that killed 19 people, it turns out that 3 of the dead were journalists. It was a suicide bombing. A man dressed in a burqa set off the bomb at a graduation ceremony for medical students in the capital, Mogadishu. Like the recent massacre in the Philippines, in which up to 30 reporters were killed, the journalists were collateral damage. The bombers' primary targets were politicians. 3 ministers in Somalia's fledgling government were killed. Somalia is one of the most dangerous places in the world to report from. 2 foreign journalists, a Canadian and an Australian, were recently released after being held hostage for more than a year. It's been reported that the 2 were freed after $1 million in ransom was paid. The world's biggest media baron, Rupert Murdoch of News Corp, is strengthening his ties with Prince Walid bin Talal, the Saudi Arabian, at the head of the Rotana media conglomerate. Murdoch has acquired a 10% stake in Rotana in a deal that gives News Corp an option to acquire a further 10%. The deal has been described as the most significant investment ever made by a Western media company into the Arab world. The 2 companies have already launched 2 channels in the Middle East that carry the Fox brand. This latest deal will help ease the Saudi prince's cash flow difficulties. His investments have taken a pounding in the global economic recession.
We estimate Al Walid's net worth has fallen more than $7 billion.
Largely because he held a big stake in Citigroup, a troubled American bank. Women presenters on Iran's state-run TV channels will be going with the natural look in the future after having makeup banned by the country's broadcasting authorities. According to the Etamad newspaper, the head of the channel has told his managers that makeup is now against the law and any female presenters wearing it must be taken off the air. The paper also reported that children showing a lack of respect for their elders will be banned from the channel too, as well as what the government calls unruly music. Iran's state-run TV is unpopular with both critics and supporters of the government because it's dull. Millions of Iranians now prefer watching foreign-based Persian-language satellite channels, some of which are backed by the U.S. and Great Britain. Anybody using Google or another search engine to get to news sites that would like you to pay for access to their content, this may affect you. Google has a new policy that comes down to this. You get the first 5 clicks for free, and after that, be prepared to pay. Google has made the change after sustained criticism from companies like News Corp that say Google is a parasite because it makes money by directing web users to news sites that don't get paid. Are there ways around this new policy for news surfers who don't want to shell out? Experts say the limit on clicks will likely be cookie-based, so clearing out your cookies or changing browsers might help. We're back after the break with a piece on the Iranian Blogosphere, where contributors type at their own risk. Welcome back. That political protest in Tehran this past week, the one that much of the foreign news media were prevented from covering, underlined once again the growing importance that the Iranian blogosphere has in reporting the story of Iran to the world. Following the elections in June, the international media's appetite for news on Iran was insatiable. From the coverage of the mass protests to the iconic image of Neda, that story topped the media agenda. The amount of coverage has since fallen off, but bloggers and citizen journalists remain at center stage, providing information to the outside world at considerable risk to their own safety. The Listening Post's Salah Qadar now on the state of the Iranian blogosphere 6 months after the vote, and the authorities who are desperately trying and often succeeding to contain an online phenomenon with the potential to be revolutionary.
Street clashes in Tehran today, police firing tear gas.
Riot police have fired live ammunition during anti-government protests in central Tehran.
Plainclothes officers videotaped anyone involved for possible arrest later on.
These demonstrations did not just happen in Tehran, they happened in 6 cities outside of the capital as well.
The pictures coming out of the fresh anti-government demonstrations in Iran this past week were reminiscent of those images beamed all over the world during the country's contested election earlier this year.
Foreign media have been banned from reporting from inside Iran during these demonstrations.
So once again, it fell to bloggers and citizen journalists to show the world what was happening.
This footage, said to be from today, was sent to the BBC by protesters.
This video was filmed by the demonstrators themselves, who also carried pictures of those tortured and killed by the government during this summer's riots.
But citizen journalism comes at a price. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, there are currently 23 journalists incarcerated in Iran, at least half of whom are bloggers.
Iran, unfortunately, has the dubious honor of both being the very first country in the world to arrest a blogger. That was back in 2003. Also, Iran, unfortunately, has the dubious honor of being the first country in the world to have a blogger die while in prison, and that happened earlier this year. So even well before the election of this year, Iran hasn't taken very kindly to bloggers.
But the demonstrations following the June elections concentrated the Iranian government's effort on cracking down hard on online activists, with show trials and heavy-handed sentences the order of the day.
Bloggers at different times in Iran's recent history have been treated either more harshly or ignored depending on what the situation is, but definitely with the election and how controversial were the results were, they've been treated a lot more harshly. Not just bloggers, but people using social media as well.
Recently, the police has announced a special cyber unit again, which they explicitly said it's for internet crime. So they're really gunning to control the internet.
There have been reports as early as to this morning's Wall Street Journal suggesting that the Iranian government is engaged in a large-scale campaign to monitor these online networks. Iran also has a website, gerdab.ir, which means whirlpool or vortex in Persian, which is basically a website that's being used to intimidate people online and to show that the Iranian government essentially knows how to use the internet.
The Iranian government may well be getting up to speed with the activities of its online citizens, but they are no longer battling individuals. This is a movement.
Blogging is something that really took off in Iran because I think it suits the Iranian character. You know, you're not answerable to anyone, you don't have an editor, you like to express yourself. All these really match the Iranian character.
Many of the most notable bloggers who were active in the early days of blogging, 2003, 2004, many of them now live outside of Iran. Many of them are in the United States, Canada, and Europe, and other places. So the intimidation campaign of arresting people and threatening people seems to have worked.
We got a guy who has a pretty good idea of what's going on.
One such high-profile arrest was that of Hussein Dirakhshan, a Canadian-Iranian blogger nicknamed the Blogfather for his role in igniting the blogosphere in Iran.
They're very concerned about popular blogs, for example, because they have influence and they create discourses and they challenge official lines.
His blog was sort of all over the place. He talked about going to Israel and meeting Israelis and making friends with them, but he also had posts on his blogs criticizing the Israeli government, criticizing the Iranian government, and also Rafsanjani and some of the opposition leaders who opposed Ahmadinejad. In the later months, he was actually very pro-Ahmadinejad.
But despite Dirakhshan's pro-government stance, only a few weeks after he returned to the country, he was arrested.
He started blogging about his experience in Iran. He was going around meeting people, going to different parts of town, and he was, very vocal about whatever he was doing. He was not trying to hide that he was there. He expected to be arrested and questioned, but of course he didn't expect it to be like this.
And it was Dirakhshan's family who decided not to publicize his case for fear that it might make things worse. But 13 months on, his brother has decided to speak out.
After 1 year of getting no result, I'm going to speak to the media and raise awareness about this case and his terrible situation. We have to try to make sure that he's not forgotten and make sure that people know that the world is watching.
These people but the world's media is not watching as intently as it had been during the elections, and the crackdown on bloggers, past and present, continues.
There's a political agenda behind all of this, but at the same time, they can't deal with 3 million bloggers. So the way the Iranian authorities always act is that they make an example of a few. They lash out such harsh sentences that it will scare the rest.
And that policy, targeting new media revolutionaries, has featured some very public show trials aired on Iranian state television, with some very public media confessions.
I was influenced by Voice of America and the BBC because they were saying that the security forces were behind most of the clashes.
The campaign of fears, I think, will backfire. The great thing about Iranian political movements is that they're very vocal, they're very diverse, they're also they're very passionate. People who are blogging, people who are setting up websites, people who are campaigning, they've been doing this for a long time and they're going to continue finding ways to do it. But in the end, it's what people do with the information and how they use the tools that determine whether change takes place.
More Global Village Voices now on the media and blogging in Iran.
Since June 12th, the rest of the world has really found out how communicative the Iranians can be. They used Twitter, they used YouTube, they used every medium possible to communicate with the rest of the world. The crackdowns on the internet, the surveillance techniques they're using, I'm afraid the government is going to force the people of Iran to basically shut up.
There's no dialogue. The authorities are not listening. The people on the streets have been violently repressed, and now there's a new cybercrime police unit that will bring this repression to the internet. I sincerely hope that Iranians will take no heed of these new repressive developments and continue to voice their opinions online and on the internet. Because without dialogue, there is no society.
Finally, we're back to where we started, climate change and what to do about it. There are some powerful interests at play in this story. On one side, there's the fossil fuel industry, among other industries, and on the other, what has come to be known as the net roots, artists, filmmakers, online activists, who all come together on the World Wide Web for efforts like the one we're about to show you now. Australia's Midnight Oil were always a political band with an environmental bent. Now they've lent out one of their best-known tracks, Beds Are Burning, handed it over to a new generation of musicians in the hope that this would become the anthem for a movement. Now, the video is a little bit cheesy, but when you're trying to feed the world a message, sometimes a cheesy topping helps. We're leaving you now, as always, with our web video of the week, and we'll see you next time at The Listening Post.